So thank you. The Bible readings this morning come from Isaiah in the Old Testament and from Romans. They're listed up there, and the pages of the Bibles in your rows are available there. A little background to the passage in Isaiah will help to clarify some of the readings. Isaiah was a great prophet in the 8th century before Christ was born in Jerusalem. At that time, Judea was under threat from a powerful neighbour, Assyria. Isaiah saw the need for the population of Judah to look more to God rather than worry about what Assyria might do to them. So in the passage I'm reading, Isaiah was reassuring the people of Jerusalem that God was going to fulfil all the promises that had been made for the nation. So the first reading comes from Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 to 3. This is what Isaiah had to say. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called the oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord, for the display of his splendour. And from Romans chapter 8, verses 28 to 30, Paul said, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the likeness of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified." This is the word of the Lord.
By the Apostle Paul. For those of you who haven't been here, we've been working our way verse by verse through the famous letter to the Romans. A pretty complicated book, but full of amazing things that are really worth having a look at. And so we come now to Romans 8 and verses 28 to 30, which we've just had read out to us. And what we see in that passage is that Paul wants to give us a kind of a review of a grand vision of the big plan that he has for all of creation. And there are several stages that go through that great big plan. And it reminds me of a bushwalk I used to do quite a bit. The closest area where I can go bushwalking in Adelaide from my house is up behind the Weight Research Centre, up just off Cross Road. And immediately behind the Weight Research area, there's a very steep hill. And you can do a little climb that goes up there. When I say little climb, it's actually a really difficult climb, to be perfectly honest. And I'm not as young as I once was, and I find it a bit of a struggle getting up there. And the first part of the climb, for the first about 400 metres, it's very, very steep. There's places where you're almost tempted to put your hands on the ground to get up. But once you get about 400 metres up the track, there's a little level area where it's sort of the track winds its way up, and then it goes sideways for a little while, and it's actually level. And it's a really good spot because someone has erected a seat right there under a tree. And when you look back down where you've just come from, you can look down through the valley, and there's this steep-sided valley with bush on either side. And when you look down through the gap in the valley, you can actually see the Weight Research Centre, and you can see down to Glenelg, and you can see Adelaide Airport. And it's actually a really good view. And you sort of think to yourself, I've done enough. This is a pretty good spot. I think I'm going to sit here, I'm going to enjoy the view, and then I'm going to go back down to the car. And you can say, I've done that walk. But you haven't really done that walk, because there's a whole other section of that walk, that if you go all the way to the top, for any of you who have been up there, the view from the top is all the much more sublime. When you get to the top, you can see the whole of the city. You can see right up to the northern hills, right down the Fleurieu Peninsula, and it's a magnificent, spectacular view, and it's just another 400 or 500 metres up the track, and you come to a much better view. But the problem is that if you're a little bit tired, it's tempting to say, this is a pretty good view right here, and then to abandon the walk and go back down. And I want to say that I think that something like that has happened in church history. In church history, ever since the Reformation, 500 years ago, the church has been stuck on what I'd call the halfway chair of justification by faith. Back in the Reformation time, there was a rediscovery of the grace of God and the justification that comes through faith, and it was a wonderful time of correction with the direction the church was going in. But what I would have to say is, as good as that rediscovery was, and as wonderful as that has been, that's only halfway up the valley. And even though it gives you a great view, I mean, what could be better than sitting on the seat of justification, framed by the grace of God, with a view of heaven in the future? Well, it's a pretty good view, but I want to say it gets better. There's a much better view if you go all the way to the top. And that's exactly what I believe Paul is doing in this passage, is that Paul is saying to us, it's not just justification. It's not just being forgiven of sins. As wonderful as that is a step along the way. It's the halfway chair. There's something even better. There's a better view to be taken in if you will take the time to have a look. And so let's go and have a look at this passage then, Romans 8 and verse 28, where he says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." And notice this in verse 29, he says, "For those God foreknew he also predestined, those to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those he predestined he also called, those he called he also justified, and those he justified he also glorified." So you notice there's kind of a progression there. There's steps along the way. And justification is not the end goal, it's a means to an end. The end is actually glorification. That's not to say that justification isn't an important element. It is, but it's only a waypoint. It's only if you've ever done orienteering, you know you get these waypoints. You get to a certain point, and that's not the end. That's only a point along the way. You get there and you have to go somewhere else. Well, justification by faith and forgiveness of sins, necessary and wonderful though it is only a step along the way. There's more to be known, more to find. Now, forgiveness is necessary as a means of refitting us, enabling us to take up again the restoration of our original purpose and high calling. Human beings, according to the creation story, had a high calling. And, I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of, sort of stylized pictures of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And it always has, it's like a two-person nudist camp. And there's, Adam with his arm around a tiger, and Eve with her hair just, placed in, good positions to hide everything, holding flowers or something like that. And you get this idea that it was just one big kind of holiday. But it wasn't. They were called to a purpose. They had an actual purpose, and their purpose was to be proxies of God. They're made in the image of God, as we saw a few weeks ago, so that they could rule over the birds of the air and the fish of the sea, and to restore and to maintain and to cause the earth to flourish. And it started with Eden, and then it would go from Eden out to the rest of the chaos, and to see it transformed in, so the whole earth would become Eden. In other words, the dwelling place of God on earth, that it would become one big temple where the divine and human and creation are all just living in perfect harmony. And that is the grand purpose that we are called to. And what Paul is saying is that we are not just forgiven so that we can go to heaven and just sort of go to a giant kind of holiday in paradise, drinking pina coladas poolside at paradise. No, we're meant to be back to what Adam and Eve were first called to, and that's what he means when he talks about glorification. So God is doing what I'd call a divine follow-through. Now, if you happen to be burdened with the unfortunate desire to play golf, anyone cursed with that? Yeah, it's only 3 or 4. Fortunately, it's not a big issue in our church. There's only 3 or 4 people who are cursed with that affliction. But, I've got enough frustration in my life being a fisherman and a birdwatcher. I don't need that extra frustration. I've played golf, I think, twice in my whole life, and all I ever did was, I could hit the ball pretty hard and make it go a long way. I never found those balls again, though. So they're gone. And I soon realised that was not something I was interested in. But I've talked to people who are interested in golf for whatever reason, and they will tell you that there's a lot more to a successful golf shot than being able to hit the ball hard and hit it a long distance. First of all, you have to select the appropriate club to address the ball. Then you've got to stand the right distance away from the ball so that you don't cramp your swing. And that's all followed by pivoting the body in just the right manner for the back swing, then launching into the forward swing and hitting the ball not just at the right speed and in the right manner to launch it towards the green, but you have to have a follow-through. There's something that comes after you've hit it as well. And then, of course, that's only the beginning of the process, because then you have to go to another level of, after the drive, there's the chipping, and then there's the putting, and finally you get the goal. And so there's a progression that goes along the way. And I think there's a divine set of progression here that we see in this passage, where God does a whole bunch of things where he addresses us, and then he interacts with us, but then he's taking us on to chipping and putting to the goal. And that's what we need to see. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. And those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. So these are all steps along the way. Now, this word foreknowledge, unfortunately, some of these words have been infected with Greek and mythological and philosophical ideas, so that we think about foreknowledge as if God knows what's going to happen before it even happens, and therefore it's all predetermined, so just get used to your fate. No, that's not what that's saying at all. In Jewish understanding, foreknowledge is something like parents knowing that they're going to have children and then doing something about it, actually, setting up a bedroom for their child who's not yet born. It's actually better termed in a relational sense of saying that God loved us before we were born and made provision for us before we were born, because he had a plan. And so it's not like God looks down through the corridors of time and he's outside time. That's all Greek philosophy. That's not Jewish understanding. Jewish understanding is God has a plan, and he has a plan of love, and he has a plan for his children to be adopted into his family. And then he predestined, and again, that's one of those things, people have this idea about predestination, about God's just going to make things, everything that you think and say is going to happen before you think and say it. That's not what that means either, in a biblical sense. There are a lot of people who do have that sense, even especially in Reformed sections of the church, who believe that everything you say and think and do is all predestined down to the finest thing. Every word I'm saying now was predestined to be said before it was ever said. But that negates the whole relational aspect of it, and certainly that's not how the Bible understands it. What it simply means is that predestination is a definite and particular plan. I mean, when I get on a plane, that plane is predestined, I hope, to arrive where it's meant to go. And, when the call comes out, because we're called to this, but when the call comes to board, I can refuse that calling. It doesn't mean that the plane's not predestined. It is. But if I want to be involved in its predestined destination, then I have to respond to the call. So it's not some kind of divine fatalistic thing at all. Rather, there is It's just that God has a plan, and it's a good plan, and you can be part of it. And the calling there, he says he's called us, which means that we have a vocation, there's something we're called to do. A vocation is more than just a job. If you're in a vocation, you're doing what you're called to. And when you're right in the middle of what you're actually gifted to do, and you know that this is what you're meant to do, it's extremely satisfying, and you do it without getting paid. That's the kind of thing that he's talking about there. And then justification, which means literally to be declared righteous, to be forgiven and restored. And this is something God does. He says, because you're trusting in me, I declare you now right with me and restored. And then finally, we are glorified, which means to be dignified and given rank and authority. The glorification of someone is to bring them to the fullness of what they're created for. And that is the end goal. The end goal that God has for every single human being is not just that they would be forgiven of sins and justified, although that's absolutely wonderful and necessary, but that's only halfway up the hill. The top of the hill is that you would be restored to your calling, that you would be a child of God, and not just a child of God sitting around watching TV in God's lounge room eating chips, but rather it's God and sons and daughters working on the project that God has for creation. Which is why he goes on to say we're being restored in conformity to the image of Jesus, who is the true Son of God. In other words, you're going to be like Jesus. And you're going to share in his glory. We are co-heirs with Christ. That means that Jesus is sharing his inheritance with us, and we are together with Jesus in the long-term plan. As the Message translation puts this really nicely, he says, for God knew what he was doing from the very beginning. He decided from the outset to shape the lives of those who love him along the same lines as the life of his Son. The Son stands first in line of humanity, of the humanity he has restored. We see the original and intended shape of our lives there in him. After God made that decision of what his children should be like, he followed it up by calling people by name. After he called them by name, he set them on a solid basis with himself. And then, after getting them established, he stayed with them to the end, gloriously completing what he had begun. So God is going to gloriously complete what he has begun. And each one of those progressive steps are vital to the final goal of glorification, that we would become sons of God in the likeness of the sonship of Jesus. And which means it's so much more than going to heaven. And if you've been hanging around here for any length of time, you'll know that the Bible doesn't actually say anyone goes to heaven. What it actually says is that you will inherit the earth. The meek will inherit the earth. You will get back to the original job of Adam and Eve. All right, so then we go back to verse 28, which says that all things work together for good. You can only understand that verse in the context of what comes up actually after it, because in the meantime, I don't know if you've noticed this, people suffer. And the world's a crazy place right now. It's a mess. And no one gets out of this without suffering. We suffer. And again, I'm going to say that suffering isn't some predestined suffering in the sense of some people are just called to suffer this and other people are called to suffer that. I think that it doesn't matter what you do, you're going to get hit by suffering because we're in a broken world and we're broken people. And I think this whole plan of salvation is a little bit like God taking the huge risk of reaching through a ball of messed up razor wire, and he sticks his arm through to grab a hold of us, and then he has to pull us through, and that's the only way. And guess what's going to happen? Both God and man suffer in that. Jesus himself walks into the burning building of our broken humanity, and he gets burnt in the process. But he saves us from the burning building. And it's painful. And all things work together for good. So when Paul says all things work together for good according to his purpose, he's saying that the grand purpose is what counts and makes the suffering worth going through. as it said in verse 18, he says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed in us, but nonetheless, we still have to go through it. But it's not pointless, that's the point. The suffering is not meaningless if it's going somewhere. I don't personally believe that everything happens for a purpose. I don't actually believe that. I was involved in a car crash, and the youth pastor I was with was killed in that car crash, and I was nearly killed. Did God do that? No. But I live in a broken world where broken things happen, and it's inevitable that suffering happens. And however, that suffering of that family and my own is not without purpose. It still goes somewhere. God takes whatever mess we make and he can reshape it into something good. He can unpick the garment that we've sewn together, which is an absolute disaster, and then he takes that raw material and re-sews it into a beautiful garment. As Isaiah 61 says, a garment of praise instead of despair. He takes the despair of humanity and re-knits it into praise. And there's something extraordinary when a person who has gone through tragedy and suffering can actually say, God is good, because they know the purpose is greater than the suffering they're now going through. As I said last week, the pain now is part of the joy later. We can't get into the glory and the joy later unless we go through this ball of razor wire and get to the other side. So not everything is good, and not everything happens for a reason, but everything works together for the purpose of God in the end. And so what that means is, once you really get your head around this and begin to understand that everything works together for good to those who love the Lord and are called according to his purpose, when you get that revelation, then what that means is nothing really matters anymore. I've suffered, you've suffered, we all suffer. It doesn't matter. Something better is afoot, and even that suffering is not going to thwart the eventual plan. That being said, however, I have to say at another level, completely other level, everything matters. Because nothing is purposeless. Everything is contributing and being woven into this grand plan that God has. But the only way you can even begin to understand this is to realise and to know whose you are and who you are. Otherwise your suffering is meaningless. Unless you know and are called and you respond to that call and you love the Lord, because these things only make sense to those who can see the grand plan. Otherwise life is actually ridiculous and meaningless. And as the ancients used to say, what is good? If these things are true, like the book of Ecclesiastes would have it, everything is vain and meaningless. But I want to say that's not the end truth. The end truth is we are being called through suffering to something even better and grander, and that is eventually through us, you are being justified, but you're also being glorified, and you are being returned to the original plan. And I would say this is a call to faith. This is a call to say, I want to be part of that. This is a call to give your allegiance to Jesus as the Christ. Amen.